If you're just joining us, feel free to put your name and where you're watching from tonight in the chat, and we'll get started in about 1 minute. All right, I think we'll get started, everybody. Some more folks might trickle in, and that is okay. All right. So, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm the Conservation Coordinator at Farm and Wilderness. Just a few quick notes before we get started. Try to stay muted during the presentation so we don't have that feedback. And if you have questions anytime throughout the presentation, you can pop those in the chat and Ethan can address those at the end. There'll be a dedicated time for that. We are recording tonight's session so that folks can watch it. It will be on our YouTube channel. And if you're just learning about farm and wilderness conservation, we're a nonprofit conservation organization and we work primarily in Plymouth and Mount Holly, Vermont. We have a great website, and if you're interested in learning more about our conservation efforts, as well as our well-known summer camps, you can check out our websites. But for tonight, we're going to focus on Ethan. We're so excited to welcome you here today. Ethan is a forester and new author, and we're just so grateful that you're sharing your evening with us tonight. I'll just do a little intro on Ethan so folks can know. So for 8 years, Ethan served as the Chittenden County Forester, and in 2024 began pursuing his own forestry business called Bear Island Forestry. Throughout his career, he's been recognized as a thought leader and a disruptor in the conservation community. Among other awards and distinctions, he has been named the Northeast Midwest State Foresters Alliance's Forester of the Year and the American Tree Farm System's National Tree Farm Inspector of the Year. Ethan published his first book, How to Love a Forest, in September 2024. Hopefully, you have read this, or some of you have, and or you have plans to. It's wonderful. Highly recommend it. It's a great resource. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ethan.
Thanks so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for being here and those of you watching this recording sometime in the future. Hi, I'm Ethan. And it's just such a privilege to get to talk to all of you. And I've been on this whirlwind book tour for since September 10th when the book came out. I think this is about my 50th event, and I got about 20 more to go before the end of the year. And it has just been so incredibly exciting and energizing to get to share this message with you all. So this is the book, How to Love a Forest. This is what it looks like, and it's so surreal that I get to hold this and to show it to you all and to share it with you. Now, how this came to be is that there was some stuff that I wanted to talk about, and I had never written a book before, and I think for a while I didn't even really let myself believe that I was trying to write a book. I just started to write. And I found out that the time when my brain is the most creative, productive, and the best for writing is the first hour that I'm awake in the morning, which for me is 5 to 6 a.m. And I was like, well, don't know how to write a book, but I can write for an hour, and so I would just be there with my coffee, tapping away, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock, close the laptop, go work in the woods. And it was probably about 3 years before I allowed myself to believe that I was trying to write a book. And it was about 6 years before the book was finished. And then, of course, sold it to the publisher. And I was like, this thing's going to be out by the end of the week. And they said, your publication date's in 2 years. So it's been a long journey. And it's just so surreal that I can share this with you. And the process of writing the book, it's one of these interesting things that I see kind of paralleled again and again and again in my life with the writing of this book, with the work on my land, Bear Island, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, this degraded forest that I've been working over the last 7 years to try and heal. Where, if you tried to do like the whole thing, if you tried to write a book, if you tried to heal this ecosystem, I feel like I would have never even gotten started. And so what I did in both cases is just whenever I could, an hour in the morning, every day that I had that I could work on the land, tried to do what I could. And it felt like every day what I was doing was stepping off my back porch, taking a little stone and just throwing it back there. And it's a gesture that by itself is meaningless, completely insignificant. And then you do it again and again and again. And then one day you look out your back porch and you're like, it's a pretty good pile of rocks back there. And it feels like something that you could never have built, but you did, just little by little. And that's what this book feels like to me. And the reason I started to write this book in the first place was because I was working in these ecosystems as a forester and realizing how incredibly challenged they are by all manner of different things. We'll talk more specifics about this, but broadly, our forests are dealing with this stuff that we call this phenomenon that we call global change. And global change is really the term that I think you all should be familiar with as we think about the volume of threats and stressors that our ecosystems face. And it includes things like the legacies of past land use. If you didn't know this, basically every forest in New England you've ever been in has been cleared largely as agricultural land and probably maintained as open land, agricultural land, repeatedly clear cut land for 100, 150, in southern New England, sometimes 200, 250 years. And the forests that we have now are incredibly young and simple and missing all of these pieces and parts. So global change includes that. It also includes climate change, right? Which is causing all of these incredible shifts, altered disturbance regimes and drought and inundation. The term is also inclusive of things like non-native invasive plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, deer overpopulation, forest fragmentation, deforestation, pollution, all of these things that together form sort of the sum total of the threats that our ecosystems face. And it's one thing, when you have a little bit of understanding about forests and you go into them and you're like, wow, they're beautiful. And it's another when you really start to dig deep into the nuances of where they're at and you start to see how many challenges they're facing. And, even in the midst of all of that stuff and all of those extreme threats and stressors, I feel like there's a perception that there's this dichotomy, right? Where we have over here people who love forests, people who care about them. And the perception is that the only way that we can care for these ecosystems is to leave them alone, right? We know that humans are the cause of all of these problems. And so it must be that the ultimate act of care and compassion is just to step away. And then over here, we have people who do stuff to forests, who maybe are cutting trees, who maybe are killing deer, who are like interacting with these ecosystems in a more active way. And the perception is these must be people who don't care. Now, this makes perfect sense, but it's also not true. And, the other thing I was noticing, in addition to all of these really serious threats that our ecosystems face, is how actually there are things we can do to help them. And these things are not easy. There's something as at times as complex and bittersweet, counterintuitive as cutting a tree. And there are opportunities for us to use our power as humans and our technology and our resources and these tools, not just to degrade these ecosystems, but also to help them heal. And so I really wanted to tell that story. And I'm going to do a couple of readings here. The first reading I want to do is about sort of what inspired me to write the book. And it's from the book's introduction. And again, I can't hold it up because it'd be too high, but this is what the book looks like. Once it seemed that there were only two paths to follow: a status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I have realized that neither of these two paths is enough. I have realized that the world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, death infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest, engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to love and protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book has prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices that I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In this book, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this changed and changing world. It is a new land ethic, a vision of relationship and responsibility, freedom and power, resilience and humility, legacy, beauty, and change. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent. This is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. So I say that this book, above all else, is a love story. And it's a love story, it's a love letter, I should say, to our ecosystems. It's a love letter to biodiversity. It contains all this information about ecology and sort of the nuances of our forest. And it's also a love letter to a world that doesn't exist yet, because it's the world that we can create if we're willing to make all of these counterintuitive and bittersweet decisions to use these tools and this power at our disposal. Now, I want to revisit something that was in that reading, which is the idea that this is a vision both for how we take care of forests and other ecosystems and how we take care of each other. Because the other important thing of this book is that it's a celebration of nuance, right? And it's one thing we put nature over here and like we're over here. And in fact, we need to recognize at the same time that we try to save this biosphere and these ecosystems and all the species that rely on them, ourselves included, We also need to recognize that, like, we live here, and here we are, as I say many times in the book. And at the same time that we do these things, that we build this world that works in an ecological sense, we also need to build a world that works for each other. We need to recognize that, like, we consume stuff. Everything we eat, everything we use, everything we wear, everywhere we live, that affects ecosystems. Every choice we make. And so we can't put our blinders on and pretend that we can choose to have a relationship with these ecosystems or not. We do. And I want to read this other little section that I skipped over there that speaks to that. Um, and I say this again and again, quote, forests are socio-ecological systems. Our lives are forever stitched into the green flesh of the biosphere. The separation of the human world from the wild world is an illusion. We cannot care for ecosystems without recognizing that we will always rely on them and we will always tax them. That human life will always be precious and worth nourishing and will always come at a cost. We cannot choose if we will impact ecosystems, if we will impact peoples across the globe, if we will impact the lives of future generations. We can only choose what that impact will be. And so that's a really important part that I've never seen reflected in a book like this, is recognizing that that is another place that we have to make some tough decisions and that we have to make some compromises. So going back, shifting gears here a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about me. And one of the fun things about this process of getting to talk about this book to folks like you and on interviews and stuff like that is people always want to know, how did you end up doing this? And how did you end up being a forester and end up where you are now? And it's fun because, like a superhero, I get to like have an origin story. And actually I get to like go back to all these seemingly like random choices I made and directions that I went and realize how those things actually guided me toward where I am right now, which is exactly where I want to be. And before I tell you this, I'm going to take a little drink of water. So when you hear these stories about, or you hear these accounts of these like famous nature writers and their biologists and ecologists, um, they often are like, I was the nature kid. I was like down in the dirt looking at bugs and I was catching frogs and I was tracking deer and just wanted to spend all my time in the woods. I grew up in this little teeny village called Saxton's River, not too far from Farming Wilderness. Uh, and it's like 300 people surrounded by forest in southeastern Vermont, Windham County. And I did not have that experience at all. I don't remember forest being particularly important to me or thinking that I would ever do anything, involving ecosystems in my life. What I do remember is that I wanted to get out of there bad. And I remember saying to someone my junior year of high school, saying, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont. Well, the first month of my senior year of high school, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I got this scholarship for Vermont residents called the Green and Gold Scholarship, and it's full scholarship. And I was like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. No integrity, no principles. I was just like, okay, wait, this is what we're doing. But even when I got there, I didn't know what I wanted to study, and I was just sort of bouncing around, taking random classes. And I remember, not having any idea, any clarity what my direction was going to be. Now, at this time, I was still dating my high school girlfriend, like the first big love of my life. And as I was finishing up my second semester, she was returning from this 5-month wilderness expedition with this like program. And she came back and she'd had this huge, meaningful, impactful, life changing experience. And I had not. And I'd just been dubbing around, like, playing beer pong in my dorm room or whatever. and we weren't connecting. And I was afraid we were going to break up. And so, like any perfectly rational person, I was like, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next one left in 2 weeks. And it was a 6 month expedition where we skied north for 3 months. And then we built a canoe and we canoed back down. Now, in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship didn't work out, but it totally changed the course of my life. And after that, all I wanted to do was just be in the woods. And so I worked as a wilderness guide. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt with a fir bough floor for a year in the woods of Maine. And I worked with draft animals, did a little bit of logging with horses, with draft horses, did all this cool stuff in the woods. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that if I didn't come back, I was going to lose my scholarship. And so I remember sitting on the fir bough floor of my yurt and holding a paper list, all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down and I saw forestry, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it had the word forest in it. And so I said, okay, we'll try that. And obviously ended up being a really good fit. So there's a couple things that are really special about forestry. One is that, you within the natural sciences, environmental sciences, whatever you want to call them, there are all these like sub disciplines, right? So you could be like an entomologist, you could study insects, you could be a botanist, and you could study plants, and you could be an ornithologist, and you could look at birds, and all of these other things that study sort of one piece of this system or these systems. And as a forester, you're sort of responsible for all that stuff. We're pretty focused on trees, but we're really focused on forests, these ecosystems. And so you need to know something about soil science and biology and entomology and mycology and dendrology and ornithology, you know, hydrology, all of these different things that together combine to create these ecosystems. And you start to see the relationships between these things and how they form this incredibly complex and beautiful web of life that is a forest. And there's another thing that's really special about forestry, which is a little bit unique, which is that we are at our core a discipline of action. So, imbued in us is this idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can see what's going on, and then we can do something about it. And something that I say maybe a little cheekily is that, if you want to know all of the insects in your forest, ask an entomologist. And if you want to know all the plants, ask a botanist. If you want to know every little nuance of the natural communities that are there, ask an ecologist. And if you want to know every single bird, ask an ornithologist. And if you want to do something about any of those things, ask a forester. And, it's something that I view myself really as a disturbance ecologist. And so, as a disturbance ecologist, I study not just these ecosystems themselves, I particularly study how they change and how we can mobilize these processes, these natural processes, these processes like regeneration, resilience, qualities like resilience, I should say, to affect positive change in these ecosystems. Now, one of the really interesting things, so I should say, after I left school, I worked sort of for this like industrial forest company and learned a lot about how I don't want to manage forests. But then that gave me the field skills that I needed to then get the job that I really wanted, which was working for the smaller consulting forestry company, private forestry company, working on private lands in central Vermont. And then after doing that for a few years, got this job as the Chittenden County Forester. And I did that from 2016 to June of this year. Chittenden County, the county foresters in Vermont are service foresters. So they just work for the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, and they're a public resource. They do a bunch of different stuff, but at its core, it's about helping people better understand forests and how to care for them. And, you know, I walked in the woods especially as county forester. I walked in the woods with thousands of people at hundreds of public events and noticed some really interesting things. And two of the things that I really, really was struck by was how there seems to be a lot of misunderstandings about what a forest even is, which then, and what a healthy forest looks like, which then has implications, of course, for how we care for them. So if you go into a room of people in Vermont, anywhere with a forest, you can ask the easiest question in the world, which is, what's a forest? And everybody in that room will know what it is. And then if I were to press you on it, you would crumble. Because what we know is that it's a place with a bunch of trees or something. You know it when you see it, kind of thing, and it's there and you see trees there, so you're like, it's a forest. And actually, it's one of those things where the closer you look at it, the more you realize that they are much, much more than just trees. And the a better definition for what a forest is one that I've stolen from this book, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is a book about the natural communities of Vermont. And they describe a natural community, which, by the way, is just like sort of a different way of categorizing different types of ecosystems. They describe it as, quote, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. And so the interesting thing about this other definition is it's much more expansive, right? It's like, it's not just the trees, it's all of the living things within that system. It's the trees and the plants and the animals, the birds and the bears and the butterflies, the fungi, all of the living parts of that system, the bacteria, the insects. Um, and it's also their physical environment, the place where they are, which is itself unique. And even the components of that ecosystem that we would typically think of as abiotic or non-living components, things like soils and waters. And it is even the natural processes that change those ecosystems over time. Things like tree mortality, the profound and beautiful process of tree death, which, by the way, is as normal and as natural, as ancient, and arguably as essential to forest ecology and biodiversity as living trees. And when you really start to look at these ecosystems, you see that they are dynamic, they are changing all the time, and they are diverse. There are many things at once. And the best analogy that I can give you for what a forest is like is it's like a coral reef. So in this analogy, the trees are like the coral. They are this living structure that defines this ecosystem around which it's built. But if you or I were to picture a coral reef, we would never just, say it's a bunch of coral. And we would never just picture it as a place with a bunch of this coral. We would picture it in terms of this entire web of life, this community that's woven around that living structure. And that's how I see forests as well. So the interesting thing about redefining forests in this way is it redefines what it means to care for them as well. So suddenly, it's our job as forest stewards, as forest managers, uh, to care for not just these trees, but this entire system. And when you're thinking about it holistically, you start to realize that, for this system to change, for the system to provide habitat for all of the things that live there, for it to be itself, you might need to go in there and do stuff. You might need to go in there and cut a tree. And when you cut a tree, you're not killing the forest. You might be providing habitat for thousands of other species of living things. You might be helping that forest build soils and store carbon and provide habitat for all of these, billions of organisms of thousands of different species which might exist in a handful of healthy forest soil formed by hundreds or thousands of years of tree mortality. You might be helping that forest, which is recovering from being, an agricultural field for centuries, to become more like an old growth forest. And when you do that, you might not be taking something away from that forest. You might actually be giving that forest back to itself in a way. So I want to read a reading here from the first chapter of the book, which is called Reimagining Forests. And in this chapter, I'm working on my land, Bear Island, in my orchard, and pruning these orchard trees and sort of juxtaposing this orderly, tidy system with the wild forest around it. A group of chickadees visits me, flitting from fence to fence. I pause to watch their circus. As my pruning shears quiet, I hear nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos, the pounding of a pileated woodpecker on an aspen. As I've learned to recognize more of the forest birds, a cacophony has become a chorus. Each species of bird calls its own name. Each touches the forest in a different way, each finding habitat within different pieces and parts of this living community. Each is unique. A decade ago, I looked into the forest and saw faceless trees, each like the others. As I learned to tell sugar maple from red maple, the flat needles of hemlock from the angular needles of spruce, the peeling bark of paper birch from the creamy bark of aspen, the forest has become a creature of diversity and complexity and depth. Each tree species is habitat for different birds, insects, and mammals, each growing on different sites and in different ways, each flourishing different flowers and bearing different fruits. Each is precious. Once I saw forests as no different from orchards. I have since learned to reimagine the forest as something messy and imperfect, complex and undefinable, dynamic and expansive over space and time. I have learned to see the trees in the forest as the coral in a coral reef, the living structure at the center of a community of boundless depth and diversity. I have learned that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. It is something we need to develop. I have learned that forests are not supposed to be pleasant or understandable or beautiful to us. They are what they are, and it is up to us to meet them there. Now, when I look into the forest, I see kaleidoscopes of interactions and connections, critical pieces and parts as diminutive as a bed of moss on a running log, and as massive as a mountain, region, continent, biosphere. Now I see that the fungi and the bacteria of the soil, the insects, the mosses and the lichens, the beech and the oak, deer and the owls and the bears, these things do not live in the forest. They are the forest. The windstorms and the ice storms, the forest fires and the floods, the death and the change, these things do not happen to the forest. They are the forest. Once I thought that being a forester meant being a caretaker of trees. Now I see myself as the caretaker of a reimagined forest, the steward of every piece of this incredible volume of life. So I want to go back to a piece in there which is important. This idea that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that we're born with. So there's something really interesting in walking with these thousands of people in the woods that I discovered, which is that I believe that each of us carries this instinctive vision of what a healthy forest looks like. And it's wrong. So if any of us were to walk into this forest, I call it the cathedral, this vision. If we were to walk into a forest and there were big, evenly spaced trees and this tall, arching canopy, and we could look through the understory and it was clear and open, and there was no dead trees on the ground and no dead standing trees, every one of us, I think on some level, would be like, perfect forest. And, there's potentially a bunch of different reasons why this is the case. One of my heroes, the biologist E.O. Wilson, he's actually a myrmecologist, an ant scientist. E.O. Wilson believes, and this is backed up by research, that we have a predisposition toward these environments that resemble savannas. And it could be that the reason for that is because our species evolved in savannas for tens of millions of years. And that, like every other animal on Earth, we have instincts that draw us toward our habitat. And that forests that look like that resemble that. It could also be a case of what we call shifting baseline syndrome. So, shifting baseline syndrome is where we assume that the forests that we're used to are normal, that the conditions that we're used to are normal, in this case, with respect to forests. And if you go into the forest across our landscape, there are these young, simple forests. They're usually a single generation of trees with this tight canopy that doesn't allow much to grow in the understory. And that's a function of the fact that they're very young. And these are trees, a single generation that grew out of these pastures in many cases as they went fallow. And they haven't had time to develop the qualities that we might find in like an old growth forest, which would be very different. And so, we're used to forests that look like that. And so that's what we want to see. I have seen people absolutely break their backs to try and create forests that look like them, and like clean up everything on the forest floor and just thin out the forest to create these sort of park-like landscapes. And, every time the wind blows, they like go out and pick up sticks. Uh, and the problem with this vision of what a healthy forest looks like that it seems like we all have on some level is that it has nothing to do with what a healthy forest looks like. And it's all about us, and it doesn't have anything to do with forests. And healthy forests really are almost the opposite of that. So the template that we can use for what a healthy forest looks like is in our remnant old growth forests. So I mentioned that basically our entire landscape was cleared. Here in Vermont, within the last 200 years, many of these areas maintained as open land, agricultural land, repeatedly clear cut land for the following century to 250 years. Uh, and it's really, we don't have very many old growth forests left. We think that, while they may have covered 90 and 95% of our landscape, and even in the 1700s, that today they cover probably less than 1/10 of 1%. And, you know, it's these little remnants scattered across the state, maybe 1,000 acres total. And the interesting thing about studying them is not like to be like, oh, blast from the past, this is what forests used to look like as this like, anachronistic old-timey thing. It's important to study them because those are the conditions that we find in these old growth forests are the conditions that were common across our landscape for thousands of years. That's what it meant to be a forest for millennia. And also in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, which we are in the middle of right now, and a mass extinction, those are the conditions to which all of our biodiversity is adapted. And when we look at those conditions, we find that the forests that cover our landscape today bear little resemblance to what it meant to be a forest on this landscape for thousands of years. And that they're actually missing every one of those attributes that these old growth forests have. So when we look in old growth forests, we do see, you would all guess probably, that there would be big trees. And there are, but not a lot. Maybe on average, like 10 to 12 big trees per acre. These old growth forests are equally defined by multi-generationality, this quality that in the ecological parlance we call structural diversity or structural complexity, just many different sizes and ages of trees. And actually across our landscape, also forests of different ages and types and expressions. They are also, these old growth forests, equally defined by the presence of dead wood on the ground. Imagine that. And so when we look into our modern forests, we see that all of these qualities are missing. The forest just hasn't had time to develop them, right? And to develop these qualities in some cases might take a few hundred years. And so when you sort of put that in your head, you start to realize that our sort of instinctive, intuitive understanding of what a forest is supposed to look like is completely wrong. And actually, when you go into these forests, these old growth forests, it can be really jarring. It can be the opposite of the way that cathedral stand makes us feel. And I have a funny story about this that I actually wrote in the book, where I took this group of folks out to one of Vermont's few remnant old growth forests. This place called Williams Woods in Charlotte. And they wanted to go see an old growth forest. And I said, okay. And so we started walking through the woods toward this old growth forest. And the first area that we walked through, I could tell very clearly had been a pasture 60 years ago in the 1960s. And it was the single generation of white pine that had often, by the way, white pine is like an opportunist, really good at growing in these old fields. And almost all of the pine on our landscape is not there because it's a good site for growing white pine. It's just there because it happens to be good at growing in old fields. Basically, every forest on our landscape was an old field within the last 100 years. So here we are. But so single generation of white pine trees that started to kind of fall apart, and then pushing up from the understory, this generation of these sugar maple, medium-sized trees, what we call poles. And it was autumn, and the sugar maple leaves were golden and just sort of drifting slowly, gracefully to the ground. And everybody was like, wow, an old growth forest. Beautiful. I had to sort of burst their bubble and be like, no, this was a pasture in the 1960s. Sorry, guys. And we kept on walking. And this is 100% true. When we entered that old growth forest, I heard someone's voice behind me go, oh, I don't like that. It was jarring. It was thick. There was dead trees on the ground. The big trees that were still alive were sort of like half alive and half dead. It was just like very messy and complex and didn't seem to have any order or symmetry or tidiness anywhere. And so that vision for many of us, we go into a forest like this, that, and it would like offend us, our aesthetic sensibilities. And yet, that's what it means to be a forest. That's a forest that actually is behaving the way that forests have behaved and providing the habitats that forests have provided on our landscape for thousands of years. And when we have forests that don't look like that, they're missing critical pieces of themselves. They're missing critical habitats. They're missing important components of these natural processes that sustain them. So it's this cool thing that we have to do and that we get to do, which is that we get to move past these instincts that we have and we get to challenge ourselves and we get to move past this discomfort and go beyond what our instincts suggest and to form an idea of what healthy forests really look like, even when it makes us uncomfortable. And it's this cool and radical journey that we get to go on. But until we do that, we really can't judge what a forest is like or what a well-managed forest looks like because we're still sort of drawing upon this instinct that is not relevant to the way that forests actually work. And once you start to get that vision, boy, you start to go into our forest now, and you're like, holy smokes, these forests need a lot of help. And these forests, that we assume are normal are actually completely abnormal in the span of evolutionary time and are missing so much. And the way I think about it is not about how much they're missing. It's about that there's an opportunity that they could be so much more if we just give them a little bit of help. So one of the best and most powerful learning experiences of my life was that 7 years ago, I became the owner of this piece of land that I've come to know as Bear Island. Not an actual island. Um, it's just its name. And the first time I ever heard of Bear Island, my buddy was like, "Hey, did you see that piece of land for sale? That big piece on that realtor's website?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." And I looked it up, and it said 175 acres of land, forest land, And all that there was to describe it was just this one picture of Camel's Hump, right? This iconic mountain. It's actually what we call Camel's Butt because you're not looking at it from the side where you can see that distinctive shape of Camel's Hump. You're just looking at it from the butt. But anyway, it was like as if to say, hey, buy this piece of land, you can build your mansion right here, and you can look at Camel's Hump. And I was like, I don't know, well, it's pretty cheap. I wonder what's wrong with it. And so I went to go take a look. First impression that I had, I went out there and the truck road hadn't been stabilized properly. And was straddling it with the tires of my truck. Got over that and up onto the log landing, the clearing from where that picture had been taken. And it was covered in trash. Bags of household trash, tires, busted pieces of equipment half buried in the ground, cables, hydraulic hoses, and hydraulic buckets. And going out from in every direction, these logging trails, skid trails, these 3 foot deep ruts, just bleed in murky water down the mountain. And it was not a very good place to start. But I was like, you know what? I'm here. I'll go take a look. And so I started to walk up the main skid trail, and it was really steep. And I was picking all these ticks off myself. And I was walking and walking. And as I was walking, I started to realize that there was something that was wrong. Something was bothering me. Couldn't put my finger on what it was. And I walked for probably about an hour before I realized that what was bothering me was that there were no healthy trees. And once I realized that, it was really jarring. I was like, no healthy trees. Started looking around and I was like, yeah, I can't find a healthy tree in this entire forest. What I now know happened is that 30 years ago, the previous landowner, this timber company, without the supervision of a forest or anything like that, they just told these loggers, go cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain. It's a unethical practice that we call diameter limit cutting. And it's really not forest management. It's probably closer to mining because it's purely extractive. And it's, nested within these suite of unethical practices that we call high grading. So high grading is essentially where you go into a forest and you cut all the most valuable high grade trees and you leave all the least valuable low grade trees standing. And the problem with that is that those most valuable high grade trees are also the healthiest trees in the forest. And those low grade trees are the least healthy trees in the forest. So what you're doing is effectively managing that forest to be less healthy. And the best, analogy that I can think of to describe this to you and how silly this is it would be like if in the middle of summer you went into your vegetable garden and you weeded out all the vegetables. That's what this forest was like. And there's an argument to be made that it would have been a greater kindness to the forest if they just cut all the trees, because then at least there would have been enough light where a new generation of trees could have regenerated and would have had a chance to be healthy. As it was, they just picked around, gave all those unhealthy trees more room to grow. They closed their canopies, and there we were, stuck. And so I kept on walking, and even in places where there was enough light for the forest to kind of try to regenerate, I saw that all the little young tree seedlings were getting browsed by deer. There's evidence of deer overpopulation as well. I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right down into a 30-acre infestation of this non-native invasive plant called Japanese barberry. 3 feet tall, pure, no native plants. And, I don't know how much experience you have with those plants, but in a situation like that, what that means is essentially a forest without a future. There's nowhere for that forest to go from there. As those trees die, no regeneration will occur, and it'll just be a Japanese barberry shrubland forever. And so I was pushing through that and got back to my truck, and I said, forget this place. I'm out of here. And I left. But then sure enough, started thinking about it and thinking about it, and I drive on the highway and crane my neck looking at it. And I started to wonder if that place was actually hopeless or if there was something that I could do to help. And I went back a second time a couple months later And when I went back the second time, I kept on finding all these little beacons of hope. Kept on finding that there were actually some healthy trees there after all that had just been so hidden behind these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen them. And I found that there were all these plants that I love, like sweet fern and maple leaf viburnum and serviceberry and pink corydalis and red columbine, lowbush blueberry. There were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those outcrops, and I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. And, I went home and never bought anything like that before, of course. And so I called up my old boss, this guy, Mike, who used to sell forest land real estate. And I was like, Mike, there's this piece of land, and I think I want to put an offer on it. And how do I do that? And how much should I offer? And he was like, well, let me ask you a couple questions. So, uh, does it have any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? And I was like, no. Is the access good? No. Could it be a sugar bush? No. We just kept on going down the line and kept on asking me, you know, questions about the land. I was like, no, no, no. And eventually he said, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them like nothing and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And that's how I became the owner of this piece of land, Bear Island. And, it's funny. It's one thing to believe that nature is going to solve all these problems, as dire as they are in principle, right? When we're sitting at home reading a book or whatever. And it's quite another when you're standing on that log landing surrounded by trash in a forest with no healthy trees, watching thousands of years of soil roll down off the mountain in those skidder ruts, right over the cliffs from a 30-acre area of forest without a future. And in that moment, I had to ask myself if it would be a greater kindness to that forest, leave it alone and hope for the best, or to do everything in my power to try and make it healthy again. And so for the last 7 years, it's been this journey, which I think is paralleled by many of the journeys that we need to take in many of our forests. In my case, I had to teach myself to run an excavator and restore those old skid trails and build new, more resilient trails. I had to teach myself to be a hunter and kill a lot of deer, try and lower that deer overpopulation. I had to cut thousands of trees, both to find every individual one of those healthy trees that was still there and give it room to grow, cutting the less healthy trees that were competing with them. And in areas where there were no healthy trees at all, I cut all the trees and let the forest regenerate a new generation of trees that had a chance to be healthy in the process, making this entire ecosystem more diverse and multi-generational, putting deadwood on the ground, making it more like an old growth forest. And there is a certain parody that I like, especially to that last part, which is that, uh, when these loggers came to my land 30 years ago and created all these problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life fixing, they used certain tools, right? They used chainsaws and they used these pieces of logging equipment called skidders, specifically cable skidders, owned by this company, Timberjack. And I know that because I've dug pieces of them out of the ground with my excavator on that log landing. And uh, now, two of my most powerful tools that I use to heal this forest are my chainsaw and my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder. And it's really interesting, right? Because here are these tools that certainly can be used to degrade a forest and that have many times. And used in a different way, they can be tools of healing. And they're just like us, really. We know that our species can and has degraded these forests and other ecosystems and created all these problems. And we can also help them heal. And it's been remarkable to see uh, on my land, this transformation occur in a relatively short period of time. where when I got there, I was like, this land is sort of the perfect forest for this moment, right? The Anthropocene, the age of humans. And it just has every problem that a forest could have. And now I walk through this forest with friends and colleagues, and they say, wow, this is a diverse forest, and it's a hopeful forest, and it's a healthy forest. And I say, I swear to you, if you had walked here with me 7 years ago, you would have said, this is the most degraded forest I've ever seen. And, those things, being able to make that transition, that transformation was only possible, not by leaving it alone and protecting it from myself, but by taking action, radical action, and making these bittersweet decisions like cutting trees and killing deer. And those to me now, especially because they're so hard and they demand so much of us who love these things, are the most radical acts of compassion that I think I've ever done. The most radical acts of love and care for these ecosystems. And not every forest is as degraded as Bear Island. But believe me when I tell you that every forest I walk into is degraded. Every ecosystem that I walk into is dealing with this incredible volume of threats and stressors. And in many cases, uh, it does not seem reasonable. I believe it is not reasonable to expect them, in spite of this, all these things affecting them in this completely unprecedented moment, to just be magically okay without our help, especially when we have the tools and we have the resources right now to help them. And I want to do one last reading here and then take any questions that you might have. So if you do have them, put them in the chat. Um, and so something that's interesting that I noticed as I was healing this land, Bear Island, and working on these other forests that I manage is that uh, you know my first priority with this land was like mitigation. How do we keep this ecosystem from collapsing? And I think that that's what we try to do all the time. We're just like about stopping the bleeding. Like, let's make it so that the world just doesn't get any worse than it is right now. And that's like our loftiest goal. And I'm not really interested in that at all. What I've seen happen on this land is not just mitigation, but generation and regeneration. I've seen it not just not collapse, I've seen it become something which is so much more abundant and so much more full of life. And our world is like that. We can not just, step away from the cliff, but we can build a better world. So I want to do this one last reading, a little bit of a longer one from the end of the book, which is about that. The storm clouds stamp their feet. They are corralled along the shifting path of the big river, thundering between the walls of the broad valley. The clouds move west, driven like cattle toward the mountains. As empty as it often feels, there is something beautiful about a life lived in the aftermath. Here, in the junkyard of the Anthropocene, we hold the fate of the world, all of its ecosystems, all of its peoples in our hands. In this moment, we can allow this biosphere, our home, to sink further into dysfunction and disarray, or we can make the radical and bittersweet decisions necessary to choose a different path. Inside of this catalyzing moment, we have the opportunity to reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and our relationship to each other, to redefine what we are and what is precious to us. As empty as they often feel, there is something beautiful about a landscape of forests that are just a fraction of their true potential. The forests of our lives are still only at the beginning of their journeys. They may yet become diverse and complex, rich with legacies, ancient again. With our help, these forests may rediscover a capacity for life beyond imagining, an abundance that this world has not known for generations. I pick up another acorn another product of thousands of years of adaptation and change, another precious thing chained to the legacies of the past and hurtling toward an uncertain future. Perhaps it is doomed. Perhaps it contains endless possibilities. Humidity cloaks the land, drawing tiny round beads of sweat from my skin. For a moment, the mountain is cast in golden light. It smells sharp and strong. As I touch another acorn, a raindrop strikes the back of my hand, rolling between the small bones of my fingers. Suddenly, droplets are stippling the soil like falling stars, throwing up little clouds of dust. I have nowhere to be, and so I kneel, watching the water run around the stumps and the upturned leaves, drawing spider webs on the earth. Someday I will tell my children that the caves in the talus above are a womb, the origin of all the black bears on the mountain, and that the springs in the big bowl are the source of all of its waters. Someday I will walk these trails with my children and teach them to reimagine forests as communities of complexity and depth and expansiveness, communities that are fated to change, to celebrate both the miracle of life and the miracle of death. Someday I will kneel beside these stumps, a young forest blooming around me, and teach my children the imperfect truth of what it means to love a forest. Someday I will teach my children that this world is not ours to hold, but that we hold it anyway. That each of us is a steward for one brief and precious moment in time. In our short lives, we must learn to pair power and freedom with humility, to embody relationship and responsibility, even when it breaks our hearts. Someday I will teach my children that despite everything, we are destined to thrive, that we are destined to live in a world that is beautiful. In the years to come, the traces of this moment will fade. This empty patch cut will have become a diverse young forest, the stumps softening and mixing with those of the oaks cut decades ago. I will walk through this young forest and remember this autumn day when my hands were young. I will remember that each tall, perfect oak was once an acorn between my fingertips, that this forest is a child of responsibility, something that we could only have embodied together. No one but me will ever truly know the pieces of myself that I have left on this mountain, the labor of love that being the steward of this land has been. I will know, and that is enough. We owe too much to the future to be imprisoned by the past. As the storm passes over me, I am grateful to be anything at all, grateful to be alive at a time when there is so much worth saving. I want to live in the world that will arise from this moment, the world built by people who are brave and humble and resilient, who make countless bittersweet compromises, who live their lives with the dream of a better world burning in their chests. I want to live in a world that will be created by people planting acorns in the rain. Sometimes this life feels like autumn, the exhausted end of a boundless summer. Today, I choose to live in a world in which spring is just breaking, a world that is just awakening, just beginning to discover what it truly is. I look toward the broken ridge of the mountain and feel a powerful nostalgia, not for the past, but for the future. High above the storm, the light is swelling, calling everything upward toward a world that is just beginning. Thanks. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try to just pop them in the chat. If you don't have any, that's okay too.
I have a question for you, Ethan, that maybe will get
Okay.
people thinking. It's kind of a silly question, but do you have a favorite species of tree or favorite natural community of forest types that you
Hmm.
find the most compelling?
I have all the faves.
Yeah.
Of course I love all trees and all
Yeah.
natural communities. But I have some favorites, and they're mostly from my work at Bear Island. And so at Bear Island, one of the things that happened was that, when the loggers came and they cut all those, healthy, valuable trees, a lot of them were red oak, and a lot of the trees they left behind were these beech trees that are, um, suffering from this non-native pathogen called beech bark disease. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is to bring oak back. And so I've sort of gotten obsessed with red oak. Now I call it like the ultimate tree. There's all kinds of cool things. All trees are totally necessary and special, all these native species, but uh, oak to me is really special. And favorite natural community, dry oak forest, which is like this like scraggly, scrubby areas that I find on these rock outcrops, mostly with south-facing slopes on my land. That would be this like carpet of huckleberry and these stunted oak trees and white pine and red pine, and serviceberry. They're just these really cool, neat forests. Um, yeah, and the other thing if you want to get really nerdy about it, Vermont is divided up into these different biophysical regions. So there's like the Champlain Valley and the Northern Green Mountains and the Southern Green Mountains and the Northern Vermont Piedmont and my favorite biophysical region is the Champlain Hills, which is sort of like it's where I live, and it's the interface between the Champlain Valley, sort of the foothills of the Green Mountains, which is just this like amazing, really diverse, beautiful landscape.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions you want to pop in? Oh, here we go.
We got a question about chestnut.
Yeah, so I'll read it so everyone can hear it. Your comments got me thinking about the reintroduction of chestnut. Have you ever imagined what our forest looked like when it was dominating?
Yeah, so probably the forests that were really dominated by chestnut were south of us, like in the Appalachians, and even to a certain extent in southern New England. But there was chestnut here for sure. Actually, in Vermont, though, the species that really filled that role, and that was by far the most common tree species in the state, was American beech. And it's another interesting one because beech has not been lost, but it is experiencing something that we call cryptic function loss, which is where it's still present. That's why this function loss is cryptic, right, or secret, because the tree species itself is still here. But actually, as a result of this non-native pathogen called beech bark disease, its behavior has totally changed, and many of the ecological functions that it once supported, it doesn't do those things anymore. So like we think that in a lot of the state, on my land, we have these historical, pre-colonial forest surveys, and we believe that beech was 40 to 60% of all the trees, at least in this area. And on my land, it was probably 60% of all the trees. And at that time, beech was a tree species capable of living like 400 years. And one can only imagine all of the different organisms in this forest that would have had special relationships with beech as a species that was that abundant, right? Beech bark disease, non-native pathogen introduced like in the early 1900s in Nova Scotia and then moved sort of southwest from there. And now, by the time a beech tree in many cases gets to be 40 to 60 years old, uh, it's really unhealthy and it dies. And shoots up these clones, these saplings from its root system, suckers we call them, or sprouts, that are genetically identical and are also going to get beech bark disease and die. And so its role in our forest has really changed. But I know that in southern New England and the Appalachians, they say that chestnut was like 50% plus of all the trees. And again, like a tree species that common, you would have had entire ecosystems woven around the particularities, the intricacies, the idiosyncrasies of that individual species. And the loss or the functional loss of a tree species is not acceptable. We don't know how many other things we lose, natural processes, species, habitats, when we lose a tree species like that. And so, think efforts like the effort to restore the American chestnut by the American Chestnut Foundation are really, really important because we got to get these tree species back into our forests. There are some amazing pictures. I don't know if you've seen them of, uh, far south of us, those old growth chestnut forests and people standing in them. It looks like redwoods. It's wild. And these stories about on a chestnut year, the chestnuts would be knee high. It's remarkable. But a similar thing, different, but similar thing happened up here just with American Beach.
Thank you. Um, I have another question I'm going to interject before we get to the question in the chat because it's related to what you were just speaking to, regarding invasive plants or invasive pathogens or pests. A lot of that is being discussed right now, especially emerald ash borer. Do you have any thoughts or insights or approaches to that big situation we're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of all really different. Every pathogen is different, every pest is different. The tree pests and pathogens are like really hard to deal with. We got a gajillion of them. And we got emerald ash borer, beech bark disease, butternut canker, chestnut blight, a new one that's probably going to kill all the remaining beeches called beech leaf disease, uh, Dutch elms disease, the list goes on. And um, those are like really tricky, and they require some really complex actions, and they also require like a lot of science and research to figure out how we're going to help these species survive. The other non-native invasives are like the plants are very hard to deal with. Any of you who have ever tried to deal with buckthorn or honeysuckle or barberry or multiflora rose or bittersweet or any of these know how difficult it is, but comparatively so easy compared to those, something like the emerald ash borer. And those plants, they stand still. And it's actually really important to deal with things like non-native invasive plants when we have these tree pathogens like emerald ash borer coming through, because what those non-native invasive plants do is they're in this novel environment free of all of the pests and the pathogens and the environmental constraints and the competitors in their native environment. And so they're just like a wolf in the hen house. And then, all of our native plants have no evolutionary relationship with them. They have no ability to compete with them. And so they just get completely displaced. And then what happens is, you don't just lose those plants have very important relationships with thousands of species of things like insects. And those things trickle up the food web. And then also, what you lose is the forest's ability to regenerate. Because when a disturbance happens, like an ash tree gets killed by the emerald ash borer, instead of getting this burst of native regeneration, sort of that manifested resilience of the forest, you just get a monoculture of a non-native species. And and so not only do you displace all of those understory plants and shrubs and young trees that are physically displaced, but by losing those natural processes, you lose everything. You lose the ability of that forest to become diverse and multi-generational, to grow future generations of trees, which will sustain every single other part of these ecosystems. So, it's really vital that we control those non-native invasive plants. Uh, and especially in a time when, if you're in a forest and there's non-native plants in the understory and there's ash in the overstory, if you don't deal with those non-native plants now, when those ash trees die, it's going to get way worse.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Um, all right, we have a question from the chat. Were you surprised how resilient your land was, or at the speed it has bounced back?
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. One thing that I say a lot now, because I talk about this all the time now, is that I wish I'd taken way more pictures. But when I started to do this stuff, like I didn't think it was gonna amount to anything. I just was like standing on that log landing. I was like, geez, what do I do? And I was like, well, I guess I'll just like start to pick up this trash, you know? And I guess I'll like tomorrow I'll go and, rent this excavator for a week and, make a fool of myself trying to figure out how to use it. And it's just like you do these little things and it's just remarkable to see it add up. It really is. Uh, and I should say too to manage your expectations that something that I am often told by people who are close to me is that I'm also not a normal person. Uh, so for a bunch of different reasons. Number one, because all I want to do with all my time and my energy and my money is to just like help this forest be healthy. And I understand that other people have other things they like to do. Maybe you want to like go drive around a boat or something, or, go just like relax on a Sunday instead of doing the most, grueling work imaginable. But, so I think that we should temper our expectations a little bit. The other thing that I have that has been an asset is, and also is also kind of a problem, is that I also have ADHD. Um, which I learned about sort of later in life when I realized that I would just like start doing something and then I'd be like, whoa. And it would be 10 hours later and all this stuff would be done. And I hadn't taken any breaks or drank any water or eaten any food. But I was just like ultra focused. So that has also allowed a lot of this work to occur. But yeah, no, it's wild. Like uh it's amazing how it almost felt like with these, especially with these stands where uh you know I looked through them and I was like, this is a stand of 80% unhealthy trees with a few healthy trees mixed in. And then I went there and I like found each one of those healthy trees and cleared around their canopies, and in places where there were no healthy trees, cut these pockets of trees, and then sure enough, those trees that I released from competition, they expand their crowns. And those areas where I cut these pockets of trees regenerate. And, you know, you walk through them now, and I'm like, I have this experience with what I now call my sugar bush, where I do a little bit of maple sugaring. I looked through that area and I was like, this is a diseased beach stand with a few sugar maple trees in it. And then I went there and I managed it. And then I returned like a year later, 2 years later, and I had this realization where I was like, this is a sugar maple stand with a few beech in it now. Like just that management where I almost like unearthed this other forest that was in there. It was really, really cool to see that change. And I really started realizing it when other people that I would bring there would start being like, "Oh, like cool sugar maple stand." I'd be like, "What?" This is I called this place the sugar bush as a joke because it was just so degraded, and now it's like it actually became that. But yeah, forests are resilient. Ecosystems are resilient, and I think that we know that. I mean, I think people have a perception when they talk about nature, and sort of these ideas of nature being able to take care of itself. I think that that's based in something which is true, which is that these ecosystems are resilient and they're amazing and they do heal themselves. And then also, what we need to inject into that discussion is just the reality that that resilience is not limitless, and that we can help bolster that resilience and that we might need to bolster that resilience in order to allow that forest to be as resilient as it has been historically, as it has been for thousands of years. And in the same way that, like, if you fell on the ground and you broke your arm, our bodies are resilient. That doesn't mean that you don't need any medicine. That doesn't mean that you don't need a cast, and we have those things. And so, we're not going to let, you just like suffer that injury without helping you when we have the tools to help. So that's sort of how I feel about this idea is that, like, yes, forests are resilient, and yes, but that resilience is not limitless, and we have an opportunity to participate in that in a way that's positive.
Yeah, and I think you may have alluded to this a little bit earlier, but um are there instances that you find where it is best to leave the forest alone or the stand or whatever you're
Yeah.
discussing? And how do you I assume you have a very trained eye, but how would someone who's just getting into this type of thing start to see when maybe it would be best to manage
Hmm.
versus leave it alone?
It's so nuanced. I mean, honestly, my best advice would be that you should ask an expert. Like, there are, if you live in Vermont, you have a county forester, and that's a free resource for you who can come out there and help guide you to, like, know what you're looking at and have other resources that can help you understand that. And there are also dozens of conservation organizations that all they want to do is just to provide you with more information about how to understand your forest and to take care of it. And they're trying to reach you right now. As a part, like a member of this conservation community, I can tell you that, we struggle about just like we're producing all these resources, we're trying to help people in all these different ways. And sometimes the most difficult thing is just to get a hold of people. But if you want to know that information, you can contact organizations like the Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Coverts, the Vermont Land Trust, Audubon Vermont, and many more that are just out there. The Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, that are just trying to provide resources for you to understand these questions. I think it's don't expect that you're going to go into something as complex and as nuanced as a forest and just like understand it tomorrow. Use the resources and use the people who have this deep knowledge of these ecosystems to help you. But I think one thing that I talk about a lot in the book is that, like, one of the cool things about forests is that in our world in general, I would argue, is that you can have two seemingly contradictory things that are both true at the same time, right? Like, you can have these forests that are competitive and collaborative, that are altruistic and parasitic, right? That are doing all of these things that are celebrating life and celebrating death at the same time, that are resilient and vulnerable. And by the same token, the fact that, like, forest management, it can be done in this way that's like so life-giving and beautiful. It can also be done in ways that degrade forests, right? Both of those things are true. And the fact that forest management can be this incredibly positive thing does not mean that it's appropriate in every single forest in the world, right? And so, like, I had this cool experience with some public lands that I used to manage in Huntington, Vermont, where there were these two forests, the Huntington Town Forest and the Huntington Community Forest. The Huntington Community Forest was accessible and had some really cool opportunities where I was prescribing some active management. The Huntington Town Forest was landlocked, totally inaccessible, really remote, had all these big old trees on it, and no, didn't have any issues with non-native invasive plants, didn't have any issues with deer browse, no other things that were sort of really at risk in that area, to risk it being able to just develop on its own. And so I wrote two management plans. In the Huntington Community Forest, I wrote a management plan that talked a lot about active management. And then in the Huntington Town Forest, I wrote a management plan that talked about how we should let this develop into an old growth forest over the next centuries on its own. And in my mind, both of those things are not just compatible on our landscape, but also complementary. And they can both exist at once. They can both be things that are great at once. And so I think that that's something that we need to hold. Like in Vermont right now, uh, there are some people who are like really excited about the idea of not managing forests, which is great. But you can be excited about that idea and advocate for that. And that doesn't mean you need to be like an anti-forest management person, right? Both of these things can exist at the same time.
Great. Thank you. Just make sure there's no more questions. Chat, I think we're good. Well, thank you so much, Ethan. That was wonderful. Everyone support your local bookstores. Get Ethan's book. It's amazing. And yeah, with that, I think we'll sign off for the night, but thank you all for joining
Can
us.
I
Oh
can
yeah,
I just say one more word?
of course.
So yeah, ask for it at your local independent bookstore. I know that most independent bookstores in Vermont will have it. If they don't have it at your library, ask for it at your library. And if you did read it and you loved it, post a review on Amazon, Goodreads. That really, really helps. And then if you're a social media person, you can follow me on at How to Love a Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube,
Great.
and EthanTapper.com.
Awesome. So many resources available. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.